Sorra stood near the far wall of the grand hall, just beside the tall stone pillar where the light barely reached. She had stood in that same spot for so many years that the stone floor beneath her claws had grown smooth and worn. No one had told her to stand there. She had simply learned, over time, that it was the safest place to be. Close enough to hear every word spoken in the hall. Far enough that no one had to look at her. The grand hall of the Ember Throne was a beautiful place. High ceilings painted with gold and deep red. Long banners hanging from iron rods, each one carrying the seal of a noble house. Wide windows that let in the morning light and made the marble floors shine like still water. Lords and ladies moved through the hall in fine clothing, their shoes clicking against the stone, their voices low and certain. They knew they belonged there. Every step they took said so. Sorra did not walk like that. She moved quietly, carefully, always making sure she did not take up too much space. She was a dragon, and dragons were large by nature. Her scales were a deep, dark green, the color of forest water in shadow. Her wings stayed folded tight against her back whenever she was inside, which was almost always. Her tail curled close to her body. She had learned early that knocking over a noble's inkwell or brushing against a lord's coat with her wing was the kind of mistake that people did not forget quickly. Her job was simple, at least on the surface. When a foreign dignitary arrived at court speaking a language the nobles did not understand, they called for Sorra. When a merchant from a distant land needed his words carried into the common tongue, they called for Sorra. When letters arrived in rare scripts from kingdoms far beyond the Ember Throne's borders, they brought the parchment to her without a word and expected the translation to appear on the desk by morning. She never failed. She never made errors. She had spent her whole life learning languages the way other creatures learn to breathe, naturally, without thinking, because it was simply what she did. But no one thanked her for it. There was no nameplate at any table for her. There was no chair with her name carved into the wood. She was not listed among the court's official staff in any formal record. She was simply there, like the pillars and the banners and the worn stone floors. Present. Useful. Invisible. The morning session began the way it always did. Lord Heron, a wide man with a red face and rings on every finger, took his seat at the head of the long table and shuffled his papers without looking up. The other nobles followed, arranging themselves in order of rank, smoothing their coats, exchanging quiet words with one another. A guard near the main door straightened his posture. A young clerk hurried in carrying a stack of scrolls and nearly dropped them before catching himself. Sorra watched all of it from her spot by the pillar. A visiting trader from the eastern coast was brought in first. He was a nervous man, thin and sunburned, clutching his trading papers in both hands. He spoke in the eastern dialect, fast and clipped, the words running together the way they did when someone was anxious. Lord Heron looked at him blankly for a moment, then turned his gaze toward the pillar. Not toward Sorra, exactly. More toward the general direction of where he knew she would be. That was how it always worked. No one said her name. They simply looked at the wall, or the pillar, or the empty air nearby, and waited. And she would step forward and do her work. She stepped forward now. She listened to the trader's words and translated them clearly and evenly, her voice low and steady. She had a soft voice for a dragon, which had caused her trouble when she was young. Dragons were expected to be loud. Their voices were supposed to carry across valleys and shake the leaves from trees. Her voice did none of those things. It was quiet and careful, and when she was a hatchling, the older dragons in her village had laughed at her for it. They had called her the Whispering Dragon, and not with any warmth in the name. Her mother had told her that silence was dignity. That if she could not speak the way a dragon was meant to speak, then she should speak as little as possible and let her work do the talking instead. She had followed that advice for a very long time. The trader's matter was handled quickly. Papers were stamped, a fee was noted, and the man was led back out through the side door before he had time to look around much. Lord Heron was already reaching for the next scroll before the door had fully closed. Sorra returned to her place by the pillar. 2 more cases followed. A border disagreement between 2 minor lords that required her to translate a surveyor's notes written in an old formal script. A letter from a southern kingdom that needed to be read aloud for the room. She did both without being asked twice, without making a sound when she was not needed, and without being offered so much as a nod when she finished. At one point, a guard carrying a tray of water cups for the nobles walked directly in front of her as she was stepping back to her place. He did not excuse himself. He did not seem to notice her at all. She stepped aside and waited for him to pass. By midday the hall had grown warm. The light through the tall windows shifted and softened. Sorra had been standing for hours. Her back ached in the way it always did by this point in the day, a deep, dull pressure between her wings that she had learned to ignore. There was no place to sit, so she stood. There was no water left for her after the noble cups were filled, so she did not drink. There was a plate of fruit and bread set out on the side table for the clerks and staff during the short recess, and she had learned not to approach it. The first time she had reached toward that table, a junior clerk had stepped in front of her with a polite but firm smile and told her the refreshments were for court staff. She had not tried again. She stood by her pillar and listened to the hall settle into its midday quiet. Lords stepped out to speak privately in the corridor. The clerks murmured over their notes. The guard by the door rolled his shoulders and looked at the ceiling. No one looked at her. And then the main doors opened, and a man walked in with a small girl at his side. He was not dressed in noble clothing. His coat was plain and slightly faded at the elbows. His boots were the kind made for walking on real ground, not for clicking across marble floors. He held a folded petition paper in one hand, and with the other hand he held the small girl's fingers loosely, the way a father holds a child's hand, not because he is worried she will run, but because it is simply where his hand has always been. Sorra watched them from beside her pillar. She did not know why, but something about the way the man looked around the room made her stay very still. He was not looking at the banners or the painted ceiling or the noble faces. He was looking at the people. All of them. Including, after a moment, her. He did not look away. Idrin had never been inside a place like this before. He had seen grand buildings from the outside, of course. Every common man who lived within a day's ride of the capital had passed by the stone walls of the Ember Throne at least once. But standing inside it was a different thing entirely. The ceilings were so high that he had to tilt his head back just to see where the walls ended. The floor was so clean and smooth that he felt guilty for walking on it with his road boots. Lily stayed close to his side. She was 8 years old and usually afraid of nothing, but even she had gone quiet the moment they stepped through the main doors. She held his hand and looked around with wide eyes, taking everything in the way children do, slowly and carefully, missing nothing. Idrin had come for a simple reason. A strip of land behind his farmhouse, land his family had worked for 3 generations, had been claimed in a new boundary filing by the lord of the neighboring estate. The filing was wrong. Idrin had the old papers to prove it. He had traveled 2 days to bring those papers here and ask the court to look at them properly. He had been told the process was straightforward. He was beginning to understand that it was not. Lord Heron looked at his petition for about as long as it takes to blink, then set it aside on a stack of other papers and moved on to the next matter without a word. When Idrin tried to speak, a clerk leaned over and told him quietly that petitions from common landholders were reviewed in order and that he would be notified in due course. When he asked how long due course usually took, the clerk looked at him the way people look at someone who has asked a very foolish question and walked away. Idrin sat down in the visitors' area with Lily and did not say anything for a while. Lily pulled a small notebook from her coat pocket. She always carried it. She drew in it constantly, on the road, during meals, before bed. She uncapped her small ink pen and began drawing the hall around her, the high windows, the long table, the banners. Her pen moved quickly and surely, the way it always did. Idrin watched the room. That was when he began to notice the dragon. She was standing near a stone pillar on the far side of the hall, half in shadow, wings folded flat, tail curled in. She was dark green and very still. If you were not looking carefully, you might have missed her entirely, which he suspected was the point. He watched her translate a letter for the court, her voice low and even, her words precise. She finished and stepped back without waiting for any response. No one gave her one. He watched a guard walk directly in front of her without excusing himself. He watched a clerk hand her a scroll without making eye contact. He watched the court move around her the way water moves around a stone, acknowledging her presence only enough to use it. His jaw tightened a little. He had grown up in a village where people worked hard and expected to be treated fairly for it. Not generously. Not with praise or ceremony. Just fairly. What he was watching was not fair. It was not even close. The midday recess came and the hall loosened. Nobles stepped away, clerks gathered their notes, the guard by the door relaxed his posture. Lily was still drawing, her tongue pressed lightly between her lips the way it did when she was concentrating. Idrin stood up. He crossed the hall toward the pillar. He was not entirely sure what he was going to say. He only knew that someone should say something. The dragon saw him coming. She went very still in a different way than before. Before, her stillness was habit. Now it was watchfulness. Her eyes, which were a pale amber color, followed him as he approached, and there was something in them that was hard to read. Not fear exactly. More like the look of a creature that has learned to be careful around unexpected things. Idrin stopped a respectful distance away and looked up at her. She was taller than him by quite a bit. He said good afternoon. She blinked. He asked her if she had eaten anything today. She stared at him for a long moment, as if she was trying to work out whether the question was meant to trick her somehow. Then she said, very quietly, that she had not. He nodded slowly. He told her that was too long to go without eating when you were working this hard. He said it plainly, not with anger, just as a simple fact the way he might tell one of his farmhands that they had been in the sun too long and needed water. Then he told her that he had been watching the room all morning. He told her he had seen how much she did and how little anyone acknowledged it. He said that she worked harder than anyone else in that hall and that someone should say so, so he was saying it. The dragon looked at him for a long time without speaking. Her expression was difficult to read, the way dragon faces often are. But something shifted in it. Something very small and very quiet, like a door that had been shut for a long time opening just a crack. She told him her name was Sorra. He told her his name was Idrin, and that the little girl in the visitors' area drawing pictures of everything was his daughter Lily. Sorra looked across the hall toward Lily. Lily, as if she had felt the look, glanced up from her notebook. She gave the dragon a small wave. Sorra did not wave back. But she did not look away either. The next morning came gray and cool. Sorra took her place by the pillar before anyone else arrived. She always came early. Not because anyone asked her to, but because arriving after the nobles made her feel like she was in the way. Arriving before them meant she was simply already there, like the furniture, like the stone walls, like everything else in the hall that no one really looked at. She had not slept well. Idrin's words had stayed with her through the night in a way she had not expected. She had told herself they did not matter. People said kind things sometimes without meaning much by them. A farmer from a small village with a land petition and worn boots was not someone whose opinion changed anything in a place like this. She had told herself that more than once before she finally closed her eyes. But the words had still been there when she opened them again in the morning. You work harder than anyone in this room. Someone should say so. She stood by her pillar and watched the hall fill up. Lords and ladies took their seats. Clerks arranged their papers. The guard by the door straightened his coat. Everything was the same as it always was. Then the main doors opened wider than usual. The ambassador's party came in slowly and with great ceremony. There were 6 of them in total, all dressed in layered robes of deep blue and silver, the colors of a kingdom far to the northeast that the Ember Throne had been trying to form an agreement with for the better part of 2 years. The ambassador himself was a tall man with sharp, careful eyes and a smile that stayed exactly the same no matter what was happening around him. That kind of smile, Sorra had learned, was never a good sign. Lord Heron rose from his seat, which he rarely did for anyone. The other nobles followed. There were formal greetings exchanged, bows given, hands clasped. The energy in the room was different from the usual morning sessions. Everyone was making an effort. Everyone wanted this to go well. Sorra watched the ambassador and said nothing. She knew his language. She knew it very well, in fact. It was one of the oldest dialects in the northeastern region, a formal version of the tongue that most people in that kingdom no longer spoke in daily life. Most translators would know the common form of the language. Very few would know this older, more precise version. She suspected the ambassador was counting on that. The formal address began. The ambassador spoke beautifully. His words were smooth and well chosen, full of warmth and respect and carefully placed compliments about the Ember Throne and its long history of wisdom. Lord Heron smiled. The other nobles smiled. A clerk was already writing notes with an eager hand. But underneath the beautiful words, running through them like a dark thread through fine cloth, was something else entirely. Sorra heard it clearly. The treaty being proposed was not what it appeared to be. On the surface it spoke of trade agreements and shared road rights and mutual protection along the border. But the older dialect carried specific legal meanings in certain phrases that the common version did not. Words that sounded like generous offers were, in the precise formal sense, claims. Phrases that seemed to describe shared use of land were, under the old legal structure of that kingdom, declarations of controlled access. What the ambassador was describing as a partnership was, in the language he was actually using, a slow and polite transfer of rights. Water rights, specifically. The rivers that ran through the northeastern border fed dozens of small villages along their banks. Common villages. Farming villages. Places where people lived in plain houses with worn boots and carried land petitions 2 days to the capital because they had no other way to be heard. Places exactly like the one Idrin and Lily came from. Sorra stood very still by her pillar. The nobles were nodding. Lord Heron was leaning forward in his chair with the look of a man who believed he was about to sign something very good for himself. The clerk was writing faster now. Someone near the back of the noble seats began quietly discussing where the formal signing table should be placed. No one asked Sorra anything. She was not translating today. The ambassador spoke in a version of the common tongue good enough for the nobles to follow, or at least good enough for them to believe they were following. They did not know what they were missing. They did not know there was anything to miss. Sorra looked down at the floor. She had been in situations like this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Moments where she knew something the room did not, where speaking up would mean drawing attention to herself, where staying quiet was so much simpler and so much safer. She had always chosen quiet. Quiet was what she knew. Quiet was what her mother had told her was dignified. She looked up. Lily was sitting in the visitors' gallery on the far side of the hall. Idrin was beside her, watching the proceedings with a small frown on his face, the kind of frown a man gets when something feels wrong but he cannot find the words for why. Lily was not watching the ambassador. She was looking down at her notebook, her pen moving in small careful strokes. She was drawing Sorra. Sorra could see it clearly from across the hall. The shape on the page, dark-scaled wings folded back, a long neck, a figure standing alone beside a tall pillar. Lily was drawing her the way she actually stood. Not shrinking. Not invisible. Just there, like she belonged. Something moved inside Sorra's chest. It was not a large feeling. It did not crash through her like a wave. It was quiet and deep, like a root finding solid ground after a long time searching in loose soil. She lifted her eyes from the notebook page and looked at the ambassador, still speaking, still smiling that fixed and careful smile. She looked at the nobles, still nodding. She looked at the treaty papers already laid out on the side table, waiting for ink and signatures. Then she looked once more at the small drawing on Lily's notebook page. A dragon standing by a pillar. Still. Quiet. But there. Sorra took one step forward. It was a small step. Just one foot placed in front of the other, the way she had done 1,000 times crossing this same floor. But this time it felt different. This time she was not stepping forward to translate someone else's words. She was stepping forward for herself, and the difference between those two things was so large that for a moment her whole body resisted it. She took the step anyway. The ambassador was still speaking. His smooth voice filled the hall, wrapping around the noble faces like warm cloth, keeping them comfortable and unaware. Lord Heron had picked up his quill. The signing table was being quietly moved into position by two clerks near the side wall. Everything was moving toward a conclusion that nobody in this room fully understood. Nobody except Sorra. She stepped out from beside her pillar and walked toward the center of the hall. Her claws made soft sounds against the marble. Her wings stayed folded. Her tail stayed low. But her head was up, and she did not stop walking until she was standing in a place where every person in the room could see her clearly. The ambassador stopped speaking. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something unexpected happens, that sudden held breath where everyone waits to see what comes next. Lord Heron looked at her. His expression was not kind. It was the expression of a man whose important moment has just been interrupted by something he considers very far beneath him. He asked her what she thought she was doing. Sorra's voice came out quiet at first, the way it always did. Soft and careful. But it was steady. She told the room that she needed to speak. She told them that she understood the dialect the ambassador had been using, not just the common form of the language but the old formal version, the precise legal version, the one with different meanings buried inside familiar words. She told them the treaty was not what they believed it to be. The silence in the room changed. It went from surprise to uncomfortable. She did not stop. She went through the ambassador's words carefully, phrase by phrase, explaining what each one meant in the old legal sense of the dialect. She explained what shared access meant under that kingdom's old property structures. She explained what controlled river rights meant for the villages along the northeastern border. She explained, plainly and clearly, that the treaty being signed would give that kingdom legal authority over the water supply of dozens of common villages within 3 years of the agreement taking effect. She said it all in simple words because simple words were harder to argue with. The room erupted. Lord Heron's face went from pale to red in the space of a breath. He slammed his quill down on the table and told her she had no standing to address the court in this manner. 2 other nobles were on their feet, voices raised, one of them pointing at her and saying that a translator had no right to speak on matters of policy. The ambassador's fixed smile had finally cracked. His eyes were hard and fast, moving around the room, calculating. Lord Heron looked at the guards and gave a short nod toward Sorra. 2 guards stepped away from their positions by the wall and moved toward her. Sorra held her ground. She did not step back. But she felt the old familiar pull of silence, the deep worn groove of it, the part of her that had spent years learning to make herself small and still and unimportant. It pulled hard at her now. It told her she had said enough. It told her this was the part where she stepped aside. She did not step aside. And then she did not have to. A sound came from the visitors' gallery. A chair scraping back against stone. Quick footsteps on the gallery stairs. And then Idrin was on the main floor of the hall, moving at a pace that was not quite running but was not walking either, crossing the open space between the gallery steps and the center of the room with the kind of purpose that comes from not thinking too hard about what you are doing and just doing it. He placed himself between Sorra and the two guards. He was not a large man. He had no weapon. He had no title, no seal, no coat with a noble house's colors on it. He had worn boots and a faded traveling coat and a land petition that had been brushed aside the day before. He stood there anyway. He looked at the guards and told them calmly that the dragon had said something the court needed to hear, and that moving her away from this room before anyone had actually listened to her would be a very serious mistake. One of the guards looked uncertain. The other looked at Lord Heron. Lord Heron opened his mouth. A voice from the far end of the room spoke first. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Lady Orvain had been seated at the far corner of the magistrate's bench for the entire session, a small elderly woman in plain dark robes with white hair pinned neatly at the back of her head. She rarely spoke during sessions. She did not need to speak often. When she did, the room listened, because in 40 years on that bench she had never once said something that did not matter. She said one word. Enough. The room went still. Lady Orvain rose slowly from her seat. She looked at the guards and told them to stand down. She looked at Lord Heron and told him to sit. She looked at the ambassador with eyes that had spent 4 decades reading people in difficult rooms, and the ambassador looked away first. Then she looked at Sorra and told her to please continue. Sorra continued. She finished her full account without interruption. Lady Orvain listened to every word with her hands folded on the bench in front of her and her eyes steady and clear. When Sorra finished, Lady Orvain asked 3 precise questions, received 3 precise answers, and then called for the treaty documents to be brought to her directly. She reviewed them herself, with a copy of the old dialect legal glossary that a clerk ran to fetch from the records room. It took her less time than anyone expected. She set the papers down and told the room that the signing would not proceed. She said the agreement required full independent review before any further discussion. She said the ambassador's party would be asked to wait in their guest quarters until that review was complete. The ambassador stood very straight and said nothing. Lord Heron said something under his breath that no one responded to. Edrin let out a long slow breath and stepped back from where he had been standing between Sorra and the guards. He looked up at her and gave a small nod, the kind that does not need any words attached to it. Sorra looked down at him. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like the stone pillar in the corner of the room. She felt like someone who had just done something that mattered, in a room full of people who had finally, for one afternoon, been made to listen. The days that followed were not loud or dramatic. There were no celebrations in the Grand Hall. No speeches given in Sorra's name. No moment where the nobles stood and admitted they had been wrong. That was not how places like the Ember Throne worked, and Sorra had lived long enough inside these walls to know it. Change in a place like this did not arrive like a storm. It arrived quietly, through paperwork and formal decisions and small shifts that most people in the room pretended not to notice. But it arrived. Lady Orvain called for a full review of the ambassador's treaty on the morning after the session. 3 independent scholars were brought in from the records hall, each of them fluent in the northeastern dialects. All 3 confirmed what Sorra had said. Every point. Every phrase. Every hidden legal meaning buried inside the polished words the ambassador had delivered with his fixed and careful smile. The ambassador left the capital 2 days later without a signed agreement. He did not say goodbye to anyone. Lord Heron said very little about the matter to anyone, which in the language of court life meant he was unhappy but had no ground to stand on. Lady Orvain, on the 3rd morning, sent a clerk to find Sorra before the session began. Sorra followed the clerk to the magistrate's bench with the careful, quiet steps she always used. She expected to be given a new task. A translation job, perhaps, or a review of some old document that needed fresh eyes. She had been given work this way before, through messengers and clerks and indirect requests, never directly, never with her name spoken aloud by anyone important. Lady Orvane was standing at the bench when she arrived. She had a small rectangular piece of polished wood in her hands. She held it out to Sorra. It was a nameplate. Dark wood, clean edges, simple lettering carved into the surface. It read, Sorra. Court Translator. First rank. Lady Orvane told her that a chair had been placed at the official translator's table on the right side of the hall. She said it had always been an oversight that one had not been placed there sooner. She said it in a plain and matter-of-fact tone, the way she said most things, without drama or apology, as if she were simply correcting a clerical error. Sorra looked at the nameplate for a long moment. She took it carefully with both hands. She told Lady Orvane thank you in a voice that came out quieter than she intended. Lady Orvane nodded once and returned to her papers. Sorra walked to the right side of the hall and found the chair. It was a solid chair, plain wood, nothing fancy. But it had 4 legs on the floor and a place at a real table, and when she set the nameplate in front of it and sat down, she felt the difference in her whole body. The ache between her wings, the one she had carried for years from standing on stone floors through long sessions, eased just slightly. She sat up straight and faced the room. Idrin's petition was reviewed that same afternoon. It took the clerk less than an hour to find the original boundary records and confirm that the neighboring lord's new filing had been based on a surveying error, whether intentional or not the records did not say. The land behind Idrin's farmhouse had belonged to his family for 3 generations and the paperwork showed it clearly. The filing was cancelled. A correction was formally noted. Idrin was called to the front of the hall to receive the decision. He stood there in his worn boots and his faded coat and listened to the clerk read the outcome in formal language that took twice as long to say as it needed to. When it was done he thanked the clerk simply and turned to go back to the visitors' area. He caught Sorra's eye as he turned. She was sitting at her table, at her chair, with her nameplate in front of her. She looked different from that angle. Not smaller the way she had looked beside the pillar. Just herself. Idrin smiled at her. A plain, honest smile with nothing complicated in it. Sorra dipped her head toward him. They were leaving the next morning. Idrin had told her so the evening before when he stopped by the translator's table after the session ended, the first time anyone had come to that table to speak to her rather than hand her something and walk away. He said the road home was 2 days and Lily was already restless from sitting still in the capital. He said farm work did not wait. Sorra told him she understood that very well. He laughed a little. She found she did not mind the sound of it. The next morning she went to the front steps of the Ember Throne to see them off. She was not sure why. She had never done anything like that before. She told herself she simply needed some air before the session began. Lily spotted her from across the courtyard and ran toward her immediately, notebook already open in her hands. She pulled out a page carefully, the edges torn neatly where she had separated it from the binding, and held it up. It was the drawing from the gallery. The dark-scaled dragon standing alone beside a tall stone pillar. Lily had gone over the lines again since then, made them darker and cleaner. She had added small details. Light coming through a high window. The worn floor beneath the dragon's claws. Lily told her it was for her to keep. Sorra took the page with both hands and held it the way you hold something you do not want to bend or crease. She looked at it for a long time. Then she told Lily it was the finest gift she had ever received, and she meant it in a way that went much deeper than the paper itself. Lily hugged her around the leg, which was as high as she could reach, and then ran back to where Idrin was loading the last of their bags onto the cart. Idrin walked over and stood in front of her one last time. He did not say anything grand. He was not the kind of man who did. He simply told her that the court was lucky to have her and that he hoped it would start acting like it. Then he shook her hand. She was so surprised by the gesture that she almost did not respond in time. Dragons did not shake hands. It was a human custom and nobody had ever extended it to her before. But she closed her clawed hand around his and shook it once, firmly, and he nodded with that same plain honest expression he had worn since the first moment she saw him walk through the main doors with his petition and his daughter and his worn boots. He climbed up onto the cart. Lily waved from the seat beside him, swinging her feet because they did not reach the floor. The cart rolled away across the courtyard stones and out through the gate, and Sorra stood on the front steps and watched it go until it disappeared around the far corner of the road. Then she turned around. The grand hall waited behind her, its tall doors standing open the way they always did in the morning. She had entered through those doors before, of course, but always quickly and to the side, slipping in through the smaller door set into the left panel that the staff and clerks used. The large front doors were for nobles and dignitaries and people who belonged in the center of the room. She looked at them for a moment. Then she walked through them. Straight through the middle, her head up, her steps even, her nameplate already waiting for her at the table on the right side of the hall. She did not hurry. She did not move to the side. She simply walked in, the way she should have always been allowed to.